the Identity Maze, where we explore the paradox of human connection in the global age. I'm Avadana. Let's step into the maze. If I could prove you were wrong, would you change your mind? Most people say yes. Psychology says otherwise. Most people believe they are rational and would argue that if enough evidence appeared, they would simply change their mind. But what if that's not what actually happens? What if changing our mind is one of the most difficult things a human being can do? Think about it for a moment. A scientist defending a theory, a politician defending a policy, a parent defending a belief, an investor defending a decision, person defending their identity. The facts may change, the evidence may change, the world may change, and yet the belief often remains. Now you may be asking, why is this so? And the simple answer is, because changing our mind isn't just an intellectual exercise, it's a psychological event. A challenge to the model of reality you've built inside your head. For centuries, philosophers have debated whether reality is fundamentally physical, material, rational, spiritual, or something else entirely. But beneath those debates lies a more personal question. What happens when reality no longer agrees with the story we tell ourselves about it? Because the hardest belief to question is rarely the one we hold, it's the one that holds us. So far, throughout this series, we've explored enemies, beliefs, choosing sides, and algorithms, but all of them point toward the same underlying question. Why do human beings hold on to ideas so tightly? Why can two intelligent people look at the same evidence and reach completely different conclusions? Why do people double down when they're proven wrong? And why do some beliefs survive long after the evidence that created them has disappeared? The answer begins with a misunderstanding. Most people think they possess beliefs, but often beliefs possess them. And if that sounds dramatic, consider this. Every major conflict in human history contains people who were absolutely convinced they were right. Every ideology, every tribe, every enemy, every certainty, which means the danger isn't having beliefs. The danger is losing the ability to question them. A belief is not simply an opinion. It becomes part of the structure through which reality is interpreted. Like a pair of glasses you forget you're wearing. Eventually, you stop seeing the glasses. You only see the world. The modern problem is that algorithms often keep polishing the same lenses, showing us more of what feels familiar, more of what feels right, more of what confirms the map we already have. And once that happens, challenging the belief feels like challenging reality itself. Which is why changing your mind can feel surprisingly painful. Not physically, psychologically. Because the mind experiences uncertainty as a threat. And when a threat appears, the mind's first instinct is often defense. Not curiosity, not openness, defense. Most of us like to think we are rational, that we follow evidence wherever it leads, that our beliefs are based on facts. But if that were entirely true, changing our minds would be easy. New evidence appears, old belief disappears. Simple. Yet human beings rarely operate this way, because rationality often arrives after the decision has already been made. We feel first, then explain. We react first, then justify. We choose first, then rationalize. The uncomfortable truth is that reasoning is often used less like a compass and more like a lawyer, not to discover what is true, but to defend what we already believe. This is why arguments rarely change minds, and why facts often bounce off identity like rain against glass. Because when a belief becomes tied to who we are, evidence becomes personal. and personal challenges feel threatening. Rationalism teaches us that reason is one of our most powerful tools, and it is. But reason can only guide us toward truth when we are willing to let it challenge the beliefs we already hold. Otherwise, it becomes something else, a defense mechanism disguised as logic. This is where philosophy becomes surprisingly practical. Physicalism and materialism argue that the mind is not something separate from the physical world. The mind is what the brain does. Thoughts, memories, emotions, beliefs, consciousness itself, all emerging from physical processes. At first glance, this might seem unrelated, but it changes everything. Because if physicalism is correct, then changing your mind is not merely changing an opinion, it's physically changing the system that produced that opinion, which means growth is not just psychological, it's biological. If beliefs are physically represented inside the brain, then changing your mind is not simply replacing one idea with another, it's rewiring a system, altering pathways that may have been reinforced for years, sometimes decades. The belief isn't floating somewhere above reality, it is embedded within the machinery that interprets reality, which means every repeated thought strengthens a pathway, every repeated assumption deepens a groove, every repeated certainty makes alternative explanations harder to see. Suddenly, the phrase, "I can't see it any other way," takes on a very different meaning. Perhaps you honestly cannot. Not because you're stupid, not because you're irrational, but because your mind has become exceptionally efficient at seeing one version of reality and exceptionally resistant to seeing another. Before we understand why changing your mind feels so difficult, we need to understand what happens when reality collides with belief. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. Most people experience it simply as discomfort, a feeling that something doesn't fit, a fact that refuses to sit neatly inside the story we already believe. Imagine believing something for years, then encountering evidence that challenges it. At that moment, two realities begin competing for space inside the mind: the belief you've lived by and the information that threatens it. Something has to give. In theory, we could change the belief. In practice, something else often happens first. Ego protection. The mind begins searching for reasons to dismiss the challenge, to explain it away, to defend the existing story. This isn't necessarily dishonesty. Often it happens automatically, because if a belief has become part of your identity, then questioning the belief can feel like questioning yourself. This is where belief defense begins. Not because people hate truth, but because people fear losing the version of themselves built around the belief. And perhaps this is the deepest question in the entire episode. If beliefs become identity, can we ever change? The answer appears to be yes, but only at a cost. Because meaningful change often requires a partial death of who we thought we were. The scientist must let go of certainty. The politician must let go of ideology. The parent must let go of assumptions. The individual must let go of the story that once explained the world. And that can feel frightening, because every identity provides stability, even when it is wrong. The deeper challenge isn't changing a belief. The deeper challenge is surviving the uncertainty that follows. Yet, that said, sometimes people do change. Sometimes they abandon lifelong beliefs. They leave political tribes and walk away from ideologies. They question identities they once thought were permanent. But what makes that possible? Consciousness. Not consciousness as a mystical concept, but consciousness as awareness itself. The ability to observe your own thinking, to notice a thought without immediately becoming it, to recognize a belief without automatically defending it, to watch your own reactions unfolding in real time. Perhaps consciousness is not the voice in your head. Perhaps consciousness is the part that can hear the voice, the part capable of noticing when a thought appears, and capable of asking, is this true? Is this useful? Is this mine? That ability creates a gap, a tiny gap, between stimulus and response, between belief and defense, between certainty and curiosity, and inside that gap, transformation becomes possible. Because the moment you become aware of your own thinking, you gain the ability to question it. And the moment you can question it, you gain the possibility of changing it. If consciousness makes change possible, why don't we do it more often? And the answer is simple. Because changing our mind carries a cost. Sometimes a social cost, sometimes an emotional cost, and sometimes an existential cost. Changing your mind can mean admitting you were wrong, losing status, disappointing your tribe, questioning your identity, facing uncertainty, and uncertainty is uncomfortable. This is exactly why we explored fear in the psychology of picking sides. Fear does not always arrive as panic. Sometimes it arrives as certainty. Certainty can feel safe. Curiosity feels risky. And that is why people often defend familiar beliefs, even when those beliefs stop serving them. Not because the belief is true, but because it is familiar. The mind often prefers a familiar prison to an unfamiliar freedom. Now we arrive at the modern complication, algorithms. Because changing your mind has always been difficult, but today something is helping our beliefs survive. Our feeds, our recommendations, our information environments. The algorithm doesn't simply show us what we believe. It often shows us more of what we already engage with. More agreement, more validation, more certainty. And certainty is addictive. The result is that our existing beliefs begin echoing back at us. Repeated, confirmed, strengthened. Not because they're necessarily correct, but because they're familiar. This is how attention becomes identity, and identity becomes reality. Not objective reality, psychological reality, the world as we experience it, which means that changing your mind today often requires overcoming two forces simultaneously, your own psychology and the environment reinforcing it. The algorithm doesn't tell you what to believe, but it quietly decides which beliefs you keep encountering. Perhaps consciousness serves a deeper purpose than we realize. Perhaps consciousness is not merely awareness of the world. Perhaps it's awareness of our relationship with the world, the ability to examine our assumptions, question our stories, challenge our certainties, expand our maps. Because growth rarely begins with certainty. Growth begins when certainty cracks. When something no longer fits, when reality refuses to obey our expectations, and in that moment we face a choice. Defend what we know, defend the map, or expand it. Most people assume changing your mind means losing something. Perhaps changing our mind is actually gaining access to a larger reality. A reality that was always there, waiting beyond the borders of certainty. The strongest minds are not the ones that never change. They're the ones willing to outgrow themselves. Now, before I close off today's conversation, I'd like you to take a moment to consider this. Which belief in your life feels completely unquestionable? What conclusion feels so obvious that challenging it seems ridiculous? Because that may be exactly where the maze begins. not because the belief is wrong, but because certainty has a way of hiding its own boundaries. Remember, the greatest breakthroughs in science, philosophy, politics, and personal growth often began with someone questioning what everybody else assumed was obvious. So why does changing your mind feel impossible? Because beliefs are not just ideas. They're structures, they're habits, they're identities, they're pathways inside the mind. And questioning them can feel like questioning yourself. Cognitive dissonance creates discomfort. Ego protection shields the identity. Belief defense preserves the story. Together, they form a remarkably effective system for keeping us exactly as we are. And yet, consciousness offers something extraordinary. The ability to step back, to observe, to question, to reconsider, to become aware of the stories shaping our reality, the enemies you create, the sides you choose, the beliefs you defend, the algorithms you follow. And perhaps that's the deeper lesson running through this entire series. The goal is not to avoid being wrong. The goal is not to become the kind of person who is never mistaken. The goal is to become the kind of person who can recognize it. Because certainty can make us feel safe, but growth begins where certainty ends. And maybe that is what consciousness is really for. Not protecting the map, but updating it. Not defending reality as we imagine it to be, but becoming willing to see it as it is. Because the hardest belief to question is rarely the one you hold, it's the one that holds you. Until next time, keep questioning the map, because the moment you think you've escaped the maze, you may have just found a larger one, and you're now inside it. Welcome to the identity maze. If this conversation made you think differently, share it with someone. If you enjoyed the episode, follow the show. And join us next time as we continue exploring how beliefs form, how identities evolve, and how awareness can change the way we see ourselves. This is the Identity Maze, hosted by Ava Dana. Thanks for listening and sharing.